we saw an example of why Mr. Johnson has been elected to the 2 halls of fame. Mr. Johnson, if you would come forward, please. On behalf of the Illinois Business Hall of Fame, we'd like to present you with this Pledge of Trusteeship. Let me just take a minute to read it, and then you can tell us how you did it and what we need to know. It says that as the Illinois Business Hall of Fame awards this Pledge of Trusteeship to John H. Johnson, as trustee for the business success story of John H. Johnson, the Illinois Business Hall of Fame pledges its energies and resources to the task of keeping the story alive in the consciousness of future generations of Illinoisans. And all these faculty members have the responsibility to see that your story gets into their classrooms. As trustee, we pledge our energies and resources to the task of maintaining a collection of historical materials concerning your life and career. And Jim Grimm, whom, where are you hiding, Jim? From Illinois State University, has indicated he particularly would like to help work on that. As trustee, the Illinois Business Hall of Fame pledges its energies and resources to the task of encouraging the faculty and students of our colleges and universities to study your career and further clarify what you did and the lessons that we can learn from it. And we pledge to do this in perpetuity as long as our resources and good health and that of our next generation holds up. Congratulations, and please now tell us how you did it.
When Lyndon Johnson was running for the presidency, they made some reference to Jerry Ford, who later became one of our distinguished presidents. And Lyndon Johnson said, the trouble with Jerry is that he cannot do 2 things at one time, like walking and chewing gum. So I want you to know that one of the things I preach in my institution is that we have to do more than one thing at one time. As a matter of fact, a young woman who worked for me went to work for the University of Illinois, incidentally. And she said when she got over there, the lady was trying to apologize for the 2 jobs she wanted her to do. And she said, gee, I've been used to doing 6. So this is going to be easy. Because when you start out small, the one thing you have to do is you have to teach generalism. We try to develop generalists instead of specialists. In a practical way, I remember I got that idea because I had a secretary and I had a bookkeeper and I had a cashier. And one day the money was there and the cashier was not there. And I said to the secretary, you got to open the mail and send the money to the bank. She said, but you hired me as a secretary. I said, but if you don't send the money to the bank, you will not get paid. I understand that. She opened the mail. Well, I'm from Arkansas, and I've lived in Chicago since I was 15 years old. I'm now 71. And I had a very difficult life in Arkansas. It wasn't about discrimination or race or anything like that. It was about poverty. And I guess, you know, when I was growing up in this small segregated town of 600 people, and when my mother worked as a domestic, I never thought I'd be honored like this. There was no high school in this town. And my mother had never gone beyond the 3rd grade. But she believed in the possibilities of education. No one in my family had ever finished high school. And her dream was just for me to finish high school. My father had died when I was 6, and she had a friend in Chicago. So she worked to save enough money, working as a domestic, working on levee camps, cooking, washing, ironing. And incidentally, I know how to do all those things because she made me help her. As a matter of fact, when I got married, my wife would get angry at me and she said, well, if you don't do this, I won't cook dinner. And I said, I don't care because I can cook better than you. I would wash those shirts and I said, hell, I know how to wash an iron shirts better than you. My mother taught me to be self-sufficient. And I finished the elementary school, and she had not saved enough money for us to come to Chicago. And so she said, I think it's going to take me another year. So I thought, gee, you know, I'll have a year to play and just relax while she saves this money. I'm having to work. But she said, no, you're going back to elementary school, going back to the 8th grade, and you're going to stay in there until I get enough money to take you to Chicago. It happened that she got enough money at the end of the second year. But I'm one of the few people who has 2 diplomas from the 8th grade. And I want you to know that I was an honor student the second time. So anyway, the time finally came, and we came to Chicago, and I didn't know anyone here. My mother had just this one friend who lived on East 44th Street. So I went first to the Wendell Phillips High School, and later graduated from the DuSable High School. I didn't have any money to take girls out. I had an extreme Southern accent. I was shy. I was bow-legged, and bow-legged was not considered sexy as sometimes is now. It was a point of ridicule when I came along. And so, I thought, I've got to get back at these people. You know, they're laughing at me, they're ridiculing me. And so I began to study harder than they did. And so I got excellent grades. I read Dale Carnegie on how to win friends and influence people. I read Think and Grow Rich. I read How to Improve My Speech. I would practice before the mirror for hours trying to do something that would keep people from laughing at me. So finally, when they decided to organize the class, no one had enough nerve and courage to stand up and talk except John Johnson. So they elected me class president. I was interested in journalism, and I persevered, and I worked hard, and while everyone else was out playing football and basketball, I was learning how to write and how to do well in English, and so I became editor-in-chief of the school paper. I also became president of the student council. I understood all of that. One thing I don't understand is how I ended up being president of the French club. Because even now I don't know how to speak French. Despite the fact that I've been to France maybe 50 times over all these years. But anyway, I graduated from high school with honors, and I won a scholarship to the University of Chicago way back in 1936. I did not have enough money to go because it was only a tuition scholarship. And so I met a man named Harry Pace, who was president of the largest black insurance company in the North, the Supreme Life Insurance Company, and it exists today at 35th and King Drive. So he gave me a job as an office boy. He was at an assembly where I was being honored and said, young man, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, I really don't know. I have a scholarship that I can't use. My mother is still working as a domestic. I cannot continue to see her do this, so I've got to get some kind of job. This was in June. He said, well, why don't you come to see me on the first working day in September of 1936? So I'll find something for you. I learned later he really didn't have a job, but he wanted to help me. So I went to work as an office boy, and I went to school part-time, and I worked part-time. And he soon learned that I had an interest in journalism, and they had a house magazine for employees, so he had me work on that. And everything he gave me to do, I did well. And he quickly promoted me to being editor of the house magazine, and he said, you know, it's a full-time job, and you have to choose on whether you're going to go to college or whether you're going to take this job. Now, I do not recommend that to any student, and I've talked against it. But for me, John Johnson, growing up in Chicago, whose family during a part of this time had been on welfare, a job was a glorious thing to behold. And so I took the job. And out of that job grew the opportunity for me to develop the publishing business. Because as I say to young people today, you cannot go in a room and close a door and come out with a great idea for a business. You have to look for opportunities. You have to seek opportunities to be served. You have to determine what it is that you can do that someone else needs. So in the course of editing this magazine. The president of the company was getting older, and he gave me a job among all other duties, and I had about 5, was to read newspapers and magazines that had articles about blacks and to give him a digest of it once a week so that he could be very knowledgeable about what was going on in the black community, although he was a black man, without having to go through all these publications. So because I had access to this, I'd often say to friends of mine, gee, have you read this and have you read that? And they'd say, no, how can I get it? I knew about Reader's Digest. So I thought, why not a Negro Digest? Something that would cull and digest material from all around, from various publications. No one else thought it was a good idea. I tried everywhere. There had never been a successful commercial black magazine before. I journeyed to New York to talk to Roy Wilkins, the late Roy Wilkins now, who was head of the NAACP and was also editor of the Crisis, which was a house organ for that organization and the only viable publication of any kind in the magazine format that was going. Roy told me, he said, young man, it's not possible. Save your money, go back to Chicago and forget all that stuff. But it was too deeply embedded into me. I believed in it too much. I just couldn't accept that. So I finally made my way with much nerve and courage to the First National Bank to try to borrow $500, which I conceded was what I needed to buy postage to send out some letters to 20,000 names I got at the insurance company, which the president gave me the right to use. He even gave me the right to address them and all that on my own time, on the company's time. So when I got to the First National Bank, the man said, boy, and he did say, boy, we don't make any loans to colored people. Now, I could have gotten angry, and it did cross my mind. But I needed the $500. So I said, sir, who in this town would loan a colored man $500? He said, I don't know but one place. It's the Citizens Loan Corporation at 63rd and Cottage Grove Avenue. So I said, well, what do I have to do? He said, you got to have collateral. I didn't even know what collateral was. I said, what is collateral? He said, well, if you have furniture, an automobile, something of value that we can attach in case you don't pay. So I had struggled along with my little job, and my mother had struggled along, so she had finally paid for some new furniture. So I said, what if we could mortgage our furniture? He said, yes, if you can bring me a clear title, we'll give you $500. So I went back to my mother, and my mother, for the first time in all those years, balked at what I asked her. She said, son, I just paid for this furniture. I mean, I have to think about that. She said, matter of fact, I have to consult the Lord. So I said, fine. So I called 2-3 days later, and I said, Mother, what does the Lord say? She said, well, I'm still praying. So I said, maybe I'm going to come by and help you. So I went by, and we prayed together, and we cried together. This went on for another week. And finally she said, look, the Lord is apparently not going to answer, but I'm going to let you have it anyway. So she let me have the title to the furniture. I got the $500. I used it to send out this literature to the 20,000 names I had there. But before, in writing a letter, here again, and this has been the guiding point of my whole life, is that you have to talk in terms of the needs of the other person. One of the problems that I have with students, they always talk about what they want. You know, I need this for experience. I need an internship in order to graduate. And I could care less about that. What are you going to do for me? So I began to think, now, what can I do for these people that will make them send me $2 each? Because the magazine was going to be $3 a copy for a year. And I wanted an incentive to get them reduced it to $2, providing they sent the money in by a certain time. So I began to think in my own mind, what did black people of that generation want most? And I started with myself. I wanted respect. I wanted people to call me Mr. And nobody was calling black people Mr. in those days. I wanted to be thought of as somebody important. And so I sat down and I wrote a letter, which I still remember, and which is going to come out in a book I've authored, which will be published in May by Warner Books, and called Succeeding Against the Odds. And what I said is that a good friend of yours told me about you. They told me that you were well respected in your community, that you like to keep abreast of current affairs and world affairs. And the magazine that I'm bringing out is a magazine that will give you greater knowledge. It will help you to understand the heritage of black people, and it will give you pride in yourself and in your race. Now, of those 20,000 people, 3,000 people answered and sent me $2 each. And with that $6,000, I got started back in November of 1942. And among all the letters that came back, quite a few of them said, here's my $2. By the way, who told you about me? Nobody told me about them. But I hit a nerve. I had zeroed in on something that they had a great interest in. And this is one of the things I try to say to young people. This is as true today as it was then. People want to know, what can you do for them? And it has been the thing that I've done most. I've never asked anyone to help me because I'm black. I've never asked anyone to give me a quota or set aside. And while I believe that affirmative action and some of these matters are important, I've never asked for them. Because I have found that if you can convince people that what you have is what they need, you can get a response. It has nothing to do with race. I mean, I'm sure I've gotten many things from very prejudiced people, because I don't talk race. I talk about what kind of service can I render? What can I do to help people live a better life? What can I do to increase their business? And this has been what I've done all these years with the magazines. So Negro Digest, I got my first 5,000 copies out. I knew what I would do with the first 3,000 because I had 3,000 subscribers, but I really didn't know what I'd do with the other 2,000. So I looked in the Red Book and looked for distributing companies, and I came upon the name Charles Levy Circulating Company. And so I went over to see the man in charge, who was a Mr. Joseph Levy, who was the nephew of Charles Levy, who was then in the service. So Mr. Levy listened to my story, and when he got through, he said, Johnson, we can't be distributing no colored books. And I said, Mr. Levy, is it discrimination, or is it that you don't think the magazines will sell? He said, Johnson, I'm Jewish. I don't believe in prejudice. It's because I don't think they'll sell. So I said, so I've got a problem now. How do I convince this man that I have something that will sell? Now, there's really only one way to do it, because he sells to dealers, people that you see on the corner selling magazines and newspapers. So the south side of Chicago was very small in those days. Black people all lived in a segregated area. And so the insurance company had maybe 100 people working there at the time, and I was pretty popular among them because, again, I had been reading Dale Carnegie. I didn't argue with him. I complimented him when I saw if a lady, if a lady was dumb, I told her she was beautiful. If she was beautiful, I told her she was intelligent. And I don't mean that in any chauvinistic way. I did the same thing to men. So I got 30 of my friends to go around to these newsstands in the black community asking for the new magazine, Negro Digest. And when enough of them had asked for it, these dealers began to call Mr. Levy. And I carefully left my cards around on his desk and in his chair, and as I walked out the door, and so he called me. And I owned a little red Studebaker, so I rushed over there with these magazines. He said, well, maybe Johnson, we'll try a few of these books. So he put the 2,000 out for me. So the night after they were out, I walked around with my chest expanding. And then all of a sudden it occurred to me, no one really knew those magazines were there except me and my 30 friends. So I thought, I've got to convince him that there's a sale possibility for these magazines. So I still had some of the $6,000. So I got my friends carefully going to different newsstands and getting some of their friends to go to others to buy up all these magazines. And so when they had bought up all these magazines, oh, the dealers got excited. If a black person came within a half a block, they'd say, have you heard about the new magazine, Negro Digest? And Mr. Levy got very excited. He called me, said, Johnson, I think we got something. He said, you know, we got to send out releases to newspapers. We've got to put placards on the trucks. And he really told me how to promote a magazine. And we went back to press and printed another 5,000. And then we had 10,000. And it grew from month to month. But I had convinced them that I had something that meant something to them. And so I got the magazine up to about 50,000, and I couldn't seem to get more than 50,000. And then I sat down and began to think, now what can I do to move this forward? I've got to get some controversial subject. I've got to get something that will give me some national attention. So everybody was giving black people advice in 1942. It was the beginning of the war years. People were saying, blacks were saying that they didn't want to fight because they didn't have equality. White people were saying you ought to forget about equality until after the war is over. We shouldn't worry about quality education. We should all join in the war effort. And then I began to think, now, if these white people were black, would they still feel the same way? Would they want their kids to wait for quality education? Would they want to wait for equality? And so I thought of a series of articles called If I Were a Negro, in which whites would imagine themselves to be black and would say what they thought they would do under such circumstances. I got several people to write. I got Edward G. Robinson, the movie star. I got Marshall Field, a publisher. But I needed somebody bigger. I needed somebody like Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was married to Franklin Roosevelt, who was president of the United States. And Mrs. Roosevelt had shown a concern for downtrodden people. So one of the other things I've learned is that you don't have to be introduced to people. You don't have to have people refer you to somebody else. As a matter of fact, very often that's a mistake, because I've had referrals of people to me by people I really didn't like. And so in the end, I didn't see them, not because of what they had to say, but because I didn't like the people who referred them. So I don't ask for referrals. I go directly to the source. Now, some of you are Catholics, and I have great respect for the Catholic religion, except I'm a Baptist. And the reason I'm a Baptist is the Catholics pray to saints. And I don't want to talk to the man directly myself. I don't want to go through Sister Mary and Saint so-and-so. I want to do like Richard Pryor. I want to say, hello, God. This is John Johnson. You know, I want to go directly to the source. So I just sat down and wrote Mrs. Roosevelt a letter and told her what I was trying to do and asked her, I made a series of questions, asking her would she answer them. She wrote back and said, well, she'd like to, but she was too busy, she didn't have time. But here again, we have to read between the lines as well as the lines. She didn't say she wouldn't do it. So I wrote back again in another 3 weeks, and she said she was still too busy. But persistence will most often pay off. So I read where she was making a speech in Chicago at the old Stevens Hotel, which is now the Chicago Hilton and Towers. And I sent her a telegram. And in those days, telegrams were delivered when you sent them. And she came by my office many years later and had lunch with us, and she told us that when that telegram came, she had just finished doing her column called My Day. Many of you are too young to know that, but My Day was Eleanor Roosevelt. Every day she told people what she did all day. Really would be a good idea now. I think people would like to know what the First Lady does all day, except maybe they're not doing anything all day. But anyway, Eleanor Roosevelt was. And she wrote this article, and it was delivered to us, and it was printed in the October 1943 issue of Negro Digest. And it could have been written by her husband, because what it said is, if I were a Negro, I would have great bitterness. And that was picked up by all the northern papers. Then she said, but I would also have great patience. And that was picked up by all the southern papers. And so overnight, this magazine was known nationwide, and my circulation jumped from 50,000 to over 100,000 a month. And that indeed was the turning point. You know, Reader's Digest over many years used to do something called a turning point in my career. That was really the turning point in my career. I made a lot of money. We only sold it for 25 cents, but and I only got 16 cents. But I was selling several $100,000 in time, which brought me $32,000 a month. And no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't spend but 16. So I had 16 left. So my accountant said, you know, the excise profit tax is on, and the government says if you didn't start out with anything, you're not entitled to keep anything. So what you really should do is to invest in some property that will lose money now and make money later when the excise profit tax come out. So that's what I did. I started Ebony Magazine. And I still dealt with the First National Bank. And I'm still one of their customers after 40-some years. And I guess the sequel to that is no one remembers now who called me boy. They say it's got to be somebody we fired. And I guess one of the proudest moments of my life is I bought a radio station some few years ago, and they loaned me $1 million, $1.5 million just on my signature. And this is the same place that told me they didn't loan money to colored boys. And so what it has convinced me is that nothing is impossible. It has convinced me that you don't make enemies, you don't burn bridges behind you, you always hold out the likelihood that someone will change his or her mind, as has happened in the case of the First National Bank. So that this went on, and the man at the bank when I had Negro Digest used to call me up and say, Johnson, what are we going to do with all this money? We got to invest it or something. And then when I started Ebony, gee, did Ebony lose money. It did what the accountant said. The same guy who used to call me asking me what would we do to money said, now Johnson, if one more check bounces, you're out of this bank. And so I had a problem. The problem I had was that Ebony immediately got 200,000 circulation, and I couldn't get any advertising. I mean, advertising in black publication was a no-no. It was unheard of. No one was willing to be first. No one wanted to take the first step. I tried all the things. I was told, well, you need to have black salesmen first. They said, no, you got to have white salesmen. They can get in and see higher people, and they can see people at the country club and all that. And I did all that. I had white salesmen. They didn't sell anything. I got the black salesmen back, and they didn't sell anything. So finally, with my back against the wall, I said, I've got to try to sell this thing myself. So I went back to the old plan of trying to seek out someone and to convince them, to persuade them. So I knew about the Zenith electronic company. It was called the Zenith radio company in those days. It was before television. My mother owned the Zenith, and all the black people I knew owned Zenith. So I looked up and found that Commander Eugene McDonald was the head of Zenith. So I wrote him a letter and asked him if I could come in and see him about advertising in Ebony. He wrote back and said, well, I don't handle advertising. And he referred me to a guy that I'd been talking to for a year. So I thought, now, what does he handle? He handles policy. So I wrote back again and said, may I talk to you about your policy toward advertising in black consumers? Then he wrote back again. He said, I cannot help. I said, I'm going to see you, he said, because I admire your persistence. But I cannot help but believe that you still want to talk to me about advertising. And if you talk to me about advertising, I will ask you to leave my office. Now, what are you going to do? You've got an appointment to see a man, and the one thing, and the only thing you want to talk about, he won't let you talk about it. So I said, I've got to look him up in who's who. I've got to find out who he is. So I found out that he had been an explorer, that he had been to the North Pole long after Perry was there, but he'd been there. I knew that a black man had accompanied Perry on his trip to the North Pole. I found later in further research that Commander Eugene McDonald knew Matthew Henson. I also learned that Matthew Henson had written a book. So I got Matthew Henson to autograph a book to Commander Eugene McDonald. I also, knowing where Matthew Henson was, he was living in retirement in New York, we quickly did a story on him in Ebony. So by the time the point comes, I have two things to talk about. One is the book, and the other one was the story in Ebony. So when I walked into the room, one of the things I've learned is that people are human. You know, they're black and white, but they're also human. Once he decided to speak to me, he also wondered, I think, what he talked to me about. Because I went to see him in July 1946, and he had some snowshoes in his office in Chicago. So, and I walked in, he said, "Young man, you see those two snowshoes?" And I said, "Yes, I see them, Commander." He said, "They were given me by a man named Matthew Henson. He was a black man, and he is as good as any two white men I know. What do you think about that?" I said, "I think that's great, Commander." He said, "Now, you know, I understand Matt wrote some kind of book. Do you know about it?" I said, "I just happen to have an autographed copy here for you, Commander." He was very pleased. Henson had said something very warm and nice. Then he said, "You know, I don't know anything about your magazine, but it seems to me if it was any kind of black magazine, you should have done a story on a great man like Matt." I said, "It just happens that we have, Commander." And so he thumbed through the magazine and said, "You know, I don't see any reason why we don't advertise in this magazine. I never discuss advertising with him." I said, "I don't see any reason why you shouldn't either, Commander." So he buzzed the button, and in comes a guy named Mackey. Mackey came in and bowed at the waist because the commander was president of everything. Zenith, all the desks, all the tubes, all the radios. I mean, he was an imposing figure. And so he said, "Mackey, why haven't we advertised in Ebony?" So I got Mackey down. But Mackey was cool. Mackey said, "We are considering it, Commander." So Mackey was a survivor. He says, "By God, I think we ought to be in it." He said, "Of course, Commander." So then Commander said, "Well, Johnson, how you doing?" He said, "What is the magazine about?" I said, "It's a magazine trying to emphasize the positive aspects of race relations. It's trying to encourage people to succeed, even though there may be odds against it." He said, "It's a story worth telling." He said, "You know, are you having problems?" I said, "Yes, I'm having the same problem with everyone else I had with you." He said, "Well, I'm going to try to help you." So while I was in his office, he called up a man named Holmes, who was at Swift. He called up a man named Potter at the Elgin Watch Company. He called up somebody at Armour Foods. I remember distinctly, he called up a man named R. Douglas Stewart, who was then chairman of Quaker Oats. His son, Robert Stewart, later and very recently retired as chairman of Quaker Oats. They now have Smithburg, who's chairman. But anyway, all these people agreed to see me. And the commander said, "Tell them the same story." I told the same story. I sold them all, and that was indeed the turning point of Ebony. Ebony succeeded very well after that, but I couldn't seem to get 1 million circulation. The magic number in publishing is to have 1 million circulation if you have a consumer magazine. And I tried all kinds of things. I remember calling up Henry Luce. I called up Gardner Coles from Look, and Luce was with Time Inc. And I was trying to get to him through the secretary, and the secretary said, "Mr. Luce doesn't see anyone, Mr. Johnson. What do you want to talk to him about?" I said, "First of all, I'm not soliciting funds. I don't want anything of him except the fact that he will introduce me to some of his staff members who will help me understand the magazine publishing business better." I told her my story. Now, this is what is very important for students or people going out in the business world. The most important person in an office to someone who knows no one is the secretary. If you can convince the secretary that what you have to say is important, she will convince the boss. And, you know, I've had people call up and, you know, "I don't speak to anybody but Mr. Johnson." Well, I'm never going to talk to that person. But if they convince the secretary that they have something of importance to say to me, the secretary will convince me. So the secretary convinced Mr. Luce to see me. So I went in to see him, and in my book I have a picture of me with Mr. Luce, so it's validated. I told him my story. He introduced me to his editors. He introduced me to people around, people that I could call when I had a problem. It was almost like going to school. And I'm doing field work and calling in for more information when I get stumped. I went to see the people at Time Life when they were doing all the circulation in Chicago. I went to Des Moines for Look, and I learned that I tried 14 different ways, circulation methods, before I got the million circulation. Now, what that really told me is that persistence is the most important thing you can have in business. Suppose I had stopped at 10 or 11 or 12 or 13, I never would have gotten a million. I had to keep trying. And so what I learned when I got through it was not any one of those things, it was all of those things. And so I finally got the million circulation on Ebony, and of course now we're nearing 2 million on Ebony. And of course later I started Jet, and then later I started EM, and so then finally, as I was telling the men at the table there, I kept getting information. I'd speak at college campuses, and students would say, well, when you succeeded way back in 1942, those were olden times. You were lucky. You probably couldn't do it now. And I began to wonder, can I do it again? And I thought, I think I can. So here again, I began to look for opportunities. The opportunity came in the form of a cosmetic company, because we have the world's largest traveling fashion show called the Ebony Fashion Fair. As a matter of fact, my wife is in Europe right now buying clothes for it. And what it is that it's different from other shows in that we buy the best of all the garments from all of the designers. We put them together in a traveling fashion show, and it runs for 8 months now. It goes to 192 cities. But in those days, it was only going maybe to 50 cities. The girls who were the models, and there wasn't no black models before us, didn't have the proper shades. And although Lauder and Revlon and Max Factor are all bringing out darker shades now, they didn't have darker shades then, and they refused to do it. I went to see them, and they literally, as they did with me in high school, they laughed me out of their offices. And when people laugh at me, that's when I get creative. So I went back, my wife and I, and we asked the girls, what were they using? They were mixing up 4 and 5 different lines in order to get a desired shade. So we took these lines to a private lab. We had our own line made up based on what they wanted, and we developed what we later called Fashion Fair Cosmetics. It is now on sale in about 2,000 department stores in the United States, in Europe, in Africa, in Canada, in the West Indies. And it does something like $90 million a year, and this has all happened since 1973. So I thought, you know, these are modern times. And I did an impossible thing, but I did it the way I did before, just like they did Zenith, because I wanted to go highline. We were buying high-priced dresses, so you got to have a highline cosmetics. Women will know, men may not know, but either a line is high and it's sold in department stores, or it's low and it's sold in Walgreens. I had to go high. Now the only store in Chicago at that time, which was the premier store, was Marshall Fields. Now Marshall Fields not only did not have a black line, Marshall Fields didn't want any black customers. Because I remember just prior to that, a group of suburban white women had tried to get Fields to employ more blacks, and they threatened to send in their credit cards if Fields didn't employ the blacks. And all the vice president did was to tell them where to send the cards. So you know they were tough. Now how are you going to melt a company like this? This is indeed a subject for class discussion. So I thought, I did like I did before. I looked up, I said the only person who can get me in that store is the man in charge, the CEO. So I looked him up in Who's Who. I found out what his interests were. I found out that he was very interested in a lot of charitable groups. So I joined those groups. I made appearances. I gave money. I got to know him. And I never discussed what I wanted to talk about. It was almost like courting a young lady that you would like to be serious with, but you can't start out being serious with. And please, ladies, I'm not being chauvinistic. I'm just dealing with things from a male point of view, because my company has more female vice presidents than male, and my own daughter is now the president of my company. And I had a lot of qualified males. So, you know, I'm not chauvinistic. But, you know, if you're courting, you have to send flowers. You know, you have to remember birthdays. You're better off to ask for lunch before you ask to go to dinner. dinner carries with it certain implications which women don't like to deal with in the early stages of courtship. So I did all of that with this man, you know, in a figurative way. So finally I thought it was time to go to dinner. So I called him up and I said, you know, I've been thinking about going into a new business and I'd like your help, I'd like your advice. Now, you have to understand, and most students don't understand that, when they come out of school, I don't employ MBAs. And I don't employ MBAs because MBAs are taught to run things. And I don't plan to let them run my company. So I say, you got to come in under another, you know, you got to come in at a lower level and work yourself up. You just can't, because you got out of school with an MBA, you just can't come in and run my company. Now, I did make one exception. My daughter graduated from Northwestern MBA on Saturday, and I made her president on Monday. But she was my daughter. When it reached the point where I thought, the point I'm saying here is that people like to be asked for their advice. They're flattered if you ask in a sincere way. I'm flattered when people ask me. I mean, I had a young man come to see me some years ago, and he called and he told me, Mr. Johnson, I'm in the insurance business. I've been using you as a model, and I've sold a lot of endowment insurance, which is going to help our people get more education. And I feel if I could just meet you, I think I could do a better job. I could help more blacks become educated, and I could improve the race. I know he's putting me on, but I'm flattered. So I go along with him. He comes to see me. And the first thing he does is to try to sell me some insurance. But I haven't lost my style either. So I said, he said, I want to be like you. I said, well, if you want to be like me, the first thing you got to do is quit the white insurance company you work for. Because I've never worked for a white company. I've only had 2 jobs in my whole life. One for a black insurance company where I started out as an office boy and later got enough money to buy the company. And the other one is where I started out as office boy. I mean, where I started out as chairman, I'm still chairman. So now, if you want to be like me, you ought to quit that job and come to work for me at my insurance company. Now, I turned it around and I sold him. But the point is, he was on the way to selling me. And I guess what I'm trying to say, people are flattered when you ask their advice. You can very often get in to see them. So I asked his advice. I said, what should I do? And I said, you know, I know that Marshall Fields does not have a black line of cosmetics. He began to turn red. I said, I even know why they've never had one. And then I think he thought Jesse Jackson was there, even though Jesse wasn't very old then. But I also remembered my selling experience, and I said, the reason Marshall Fields has never had one is there's never been one good enough for Marshall Fields. He said, that's the reason. That's the real reason. I said, I'm not sure this one is good enough. But I've met you, I've worked with you, and all of this is true. I think you can't lie. I have respect for you. I believe in your integrity. So I want to be in your store. If it's good enough, I think you'll put it in. If it's not good enough, I'll never bring the subject up again, and I'll continue to work with you as I have. He gave it to his people. They looked it over, and a week later, he called me and said I was in. Now, once I got in, the people didn't really want me in, the people down below. And they wouldn't let me advertise in newspapers. They said, we don't want to offend our white customers. Well, I'm not going to go to the NAACP. It's not a civil rights movement. This is a desire on my part to build a business. So I said, fine. So I just simply asked someone, how much would a new line sell in the course of a week? They said it should sell about $1,200 a week or $200 a day on a 6-day week. So I simply got the same old thing I'd worked 30 years ago. Got the people from my office to go down there and buy approximately $200 a day. And they did that until I could go out in the community and convince various groups that we had this product down and that they should go right by. Now, I went from Fields to Neiman Marcus to A&S to Harrods in London and to Printemps in Paris, to a point where we're now in 2,000 stores, and if you pick almost any store in a major city where there are blacks, I'm in the top 10 in the store. So that now I'm no longer a black line, I'm a line. I'm making money for them. I'm important to that bottom line. Now, Carson's is in a whole lot of trouble now. If if I can read the newspapers properly. But I do $1 million a year in that store. They're not going to put me out as badly as they need money. I've never known anyone to fire anyone who's making money for them. And so what I say to young people is you got to be good at what you do. You got to be superior. You got to be excellent. You got to work longer than 8 hours a day. You got to be so good that you're indispensable. And I'm going to close with one little story, because I could be here all day telling you stories, but if you read my book, there's about 100 others. But anyway, the story is about Matthew Henson. Matthew Henson signed up with Perry before the turn of the century. And I think they finally discovered the North Pole about 1909. And they had made about 18 trips to the North Pole before they did it. There's still some doubt about whether Perry was there first or somebody else was there first. But for many years it was thought that Perry was there first. Matthew Henson was a black man there who had worked himself up from a cabin boy to being a direct assistant to Perry. So when they were about 100 and some miles away from the pole, and the night before they were going to make the final launch, as they sat around in the igloos trying to decide, Perry was trying to decide who would he take with him on the last lap. They had many white distinguished scientists there who wanted the honor of being there first with Perry. Perry could only take one person, 5 Eskimos, and the dogs. He agonized over it, and he came back and he said, "Gentlemen," and I read this from one of the men who was there, "it has to be Henson. I know how you feel, but I can't make it without Henson." Now, Henson had made himself indispensable. He knew how to build the sleds, and the other guys didn't. He knew how to build the igloos, and they would travel so many miles, and they'd have to build one and get warmed up and go again. And most important of all, he learned the Eskimo language. And the dogs didn't respond to English. You had to give them commands in the Eskimo language, which was a language they understood. So that great honor went to an unlettered, uneducated black man because he had made himself so indispensable that they couldn't make it without him. Now, that's basically what I've tried to do all my life. I don't get all caught up in race. I get caught up in, can I render service? Can I be better than anybody else? And I've never been discriminated against when I was better than everybody else. Never. And that's the message I leave to young people. Thank you.
That was so inspirational. I think we'll officially adjourn right now. And anybody that wants to chat with you, how quickly you have to leave?
Well, I got to get a plane to California. I have a home in Palm Springs. It's way up on the hill where Bob Hope lives. And nobody discriminates against me. I paid a whole lot of money for it.
Well, I want you to...
And I pay my dues on time. As a matter of fact, they even made my wife president of the Property Owners Association, thinking she would keep other blacks out. But we let them in. Thank you.